All right, friends, let's have a prayer and let's get going. Lord, on this day, as in every day, we celebrate your love. We remember that you loved the world in order to make it. You loved the world to be with it. You loved the world to send your Son. You love us. We celebrate that love as we open your word to us again, remembering that because of your love, you have given yourself to us, you have revealed yourself to us. You have told us what we need to know for living life on this good earth in a way that honors you and that is successful for us. We thank you for all these things that we remember, and we remember as well that when we come to you in prayer, earnestly seeking to learn from you, that you honor us in that request, and that we do in fact learn. We hear the good news about your love. So be with us now as we open your word for Jesus' sake. Amen. Okie dokie. This is one of those, in some sense, very blessed sort of days where we have just a tiny little piece of scripture that we're going to look at. Later on in the book of Exodus, we'll be reading multiple chapters with volumes of information, but that all really just says one thing. And as we are in the Ten Commandments, we're in a place where a few words say an awful lot. And of course, you've noticed that we are slowing down a whole lot as we consider the Ten Commandments because of their importance in the overall scheme of the biblical story, their importance in the life of the Christian communities, all of those sorts of things. So before we dive into the particular commandment for today, it is important that we remember the context of the giving of the Ten Commandments. Very few people, I think, probably remember the context. They don't remember the story that's being told, because we take the Ten Commandments out and we put them on a card or a wall plaque or a stone obelisk somewhere, and they seem to just sit there kind of by themselves, but they are not just by themselves. And we've looked at that context, but it's always important to remember it. God has rescued the Hebrew people from slavery. God has taken them away from non-existence, if you will, and is giving them existence again. Not just existence, but God is fulfilling his promise to bless this group of people so that they then can bless the rest of the world with the knowledge of who God is and who we are meant to be. God has taken the people out of Egypt. He's walked them through the Red Sea. He's given them water, food, protection from enemies. In all of those ways, God has been showing his love to the people. And God has been reestablishing, in some sense, and strengthening and making very obvious the relationship that God wants to have with us. And therefore then talks about the relationships that we are meant to have with each other. So the Ten Commandments are God's way of revealing to us who he is and who we are meant to be. I always use that phrase, meant to be, because we don't live up to who we are meant to be perfectly, of course. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But in being who we are meant to be, that's how we have our highest good, our deepest joy. That's how I don't know where this phrase came from, but that's how we live our best life. Have you run across that phrase? I don't know where that what's that? That's over? Is it over now? Oh, Oprah. Oprah. That's an Oprah phrase. Oh, live your best life. Okay, well, God bless Oprah. That's not a bad way of thinking about it in that way, I guess. So as we remember all those things about the commandments, we remember that we are in a relationship with God. God already was in a relationship with the people of Israel. All those things that God had done reinforced, reestablished in a sense that relationship. And now God is going deeper into how we have that, how we have that relationship and what it means. So let's remember that as we read this commandment. So Exodus 20, verse 12. Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. That's it. That's all we're going to talk about today. You might have thought that we're only going to be here for 5 minutes, but that's not the case. Okay? The way I would like to talk about this is to let you talk about this. This is one of those places I think it's very helpful for us to kind of hold these words in our mouths and our minds and just kind of let them sit there and get the flavor and play around with them and then think about what they actually mean. So let me ask you this question, and Catherine's going to get the microphone ready and be ready to come and hear from you. What does this commandment say to you? What is interesting about it? What might be confusing about it? How would you understand it and apply it in your life? All of those questions. Let's just start the conversation there, and then we'll walk through it. So, what does this say to anybody? Let me say a couple more things, but I'm going to turn this back to you in just a couple of minutes. The first 4 commandments, this is often noted, the first 4 commandments primarily speak about our relationship with God. You shall have only one God. You shall not make idols. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. You shall celebrate the Sabbath as a way of having relationship with God. That's all about the so-called vertical relationship we have with God. With this 5th commandment, the focus shifts a little bit to talk about our relationships with each other. God gave us 4 commandments to talk about Him, and He's given us 6 commandments to talk about each other. 60% of the 10 commandments are about our relationships with each other. Now, we don't want to draw too sharp a line between God and us, because those two things are very much tied together. We start with God. That's where everything starts. That's where everything ends, with God. But it cannot help but have an implication, our relationship with God. It has an implication in our relationships with others. Okay? That's one thing we can note in this. Another thing we can note in this is that this commandment is about the fundamental human relationship. All right? Now, I know that all of you have your honey that you've been married to for 800 years, and you don't know what you would do without him and all that other good stuff. This is Valentine's, right? Or maybe you don't. What is the fundamental human relationship? Love. No. Yes, you're right. Love is always a good answer. Jesus is always a good answer. But let's look a little more specific here. Parent and child. Parent and child. Right? If there are no parents, there are no children. If there are no children, there are no people. The fundamental human, you can think about your brothers and your sisters, your spouses, your best friends. You can think about all the other people in the world, but where does it all begin? Mom and dad and child. And so that's where the conversation starts, is with the fundamental human relationship. You can go through your life without ever having a friend, without ever having a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a husband or a wife. You can go through all of your life without having any other human relationships, but the one that you must have is the relationship with father and mother. Without father and mother, you don't exist. Yes.
So God created man and woman. The man and woman created a child. So typically, parents love their children when they're born. This is another symbolism of God loving His creation.
Sure.
So you've got that. So as a child, you look at your parents, and in a child's mind, that is their world. And it is up to the parents to raise that child, to nurture that child, to love that child, and teach that child of their creator, God, and to love and worship God. So in one sense, this 6th commandment is going back to the first one: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind.
Yeah. You could go all those places.
I did.
Yeah, you did. Let's start. The words of the commandment are, honor your father and mother. Who is this commandment addressed to? to children. It doesn't begin with parents love your children. It begins with children honor your parents. Isn't that interesting? The microphone's gone somewhere else. Yes.
Yes. I think we all almost think of our parents as very special, perhaps almost like God,
Mm-hmm.
because we don't exist without them. Plus, when we are born, we can't do a darn thing about it.
Mm-hmm.
They are our saviors. So I thought about this with my parents last night. And I remember thinking my mom and dad were just absolutely the most perfect people in the whole wide world because they obviously at that time loved me.
Mm-hmm.
As time passed, I wasn't perfect. And so they didn't like me sometimes, darn it. And my dad gave my mother the authority to keep me in my place.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started thinking about my mother in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved her, but darn, she didn't like me sometimes, and that just didn't feel good.
Mm-hmm.
So through my life, it took me years to realize that they were not perfect, nor was I.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of being kind of cool to my mother on certain times, I figured out, wait a minute, she really does love me because she stopped me from doing things that weren't a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, with that circle, when you put the commandment together with it, it gives you a really different perspective on how important your parents are to you, regardless of how they treat you.
Yeah.
Now, I know also that there have been people that have been treated really mistreated. That's a whole other story. Luckily, I didn't have to experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it is. This commandment is kind of easy to swallow in some sense if you've had fantastic parents, understanding that no parents are perfect, of course. But some parents do a better job of parenting. Some people do a better job of living a life. And that's just reality. That's not ultimate judgment upon a person or whether God loves that person or not. And so this commandment, in a sense, becomes more problematic, but there are some ways to deal with that. When parents are not so honorable, right? It's easy to honor the honorable, but it's not so easy to honor the dishonorable. We'll talk more about that. Yes, Laura.
There's a generational piece to this. Since we're always children, we always have a parent we need to honor. And if everybody was honoring their parents, everybody would be loving each other, and there'd be a lot of love in the community.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? There is a generational thing happening here. And you note correctly that everybody is always a child, okay? The only people who didn't have parents, you could say, were Adam and Eve, okay? They had God as their parent, so to speak. But everybody else that flows out of that is a child, and everybody else, in some sense, becomes parent. Now, I know a lot of people don't have children, and there's an awful lot to say about all that. But everybody else who gets any years on them becomes of an age that they could be a parent, so to speak. But this commandment takes us to a place where in the fundamental relationship that we have, child and parent, the key word is honor, is it not? And if everybody did more honoring, then maybe the whole thing would get better. Yeah. Good point. Over here.
Going in the same direction with my thought is that even when you become an adult, you are still their child, but we continue to honor our parents throughout their lives, and maybe even more so as they get older and need us, and the roles kind of reverse as we get older and we become more like the parent in some cases.
Yeah.
But the other thought I had, and I don't know if there's an answer to this, but if you're a child who is adopted, who are your parents? Are they your biological parents? Are they the people who raised you? Or maybe you just honor both. But it was kind of an interesting question to think about.
Yeah, that is an interesting question, and we have to note, today adoption is all over the place. I think there was a lot more adoption that has gone on in human history than we would understand or think about. Because in human history, oftentimes women died young or died in childbirth, and somebody else had to step in as the mother, so to speak. Fathers, those Roman soldier fathers, would go off to war and get killed, and somebody has to step in as a father. So um, life is not all, leave it to Beaver where everything is perfect, and it's far from that. And so there's an awful lot of parenting and childing going on between people who are not biologically related in that way. And I think the healthiest way to look at all of that is that we want to honor the people who gave us our biological start. Okay? And now maybe someday I don't know how we'll ever, and I frankly don't hope that we don't ever find a way to create human beings without the fundamental union of what female and male contribute to making another human being, right? So there's got to be a mother and a father somewhere there. And even if it's in a test tube context and you never know, at least we have to honor that sense that a mother and father come together, right? That's the way God made biology. With that said, clearly, either through accident, through whatever life brings, mother and father are not always able to be mother and father. And so other mothers and fathers come along. I would want to take that conversation to a place of honoring anyone who has served in that role. And in some ways, I can say that I've had lots of mothers and fathers, right? I do, my mom and dad were, well, dad was, mom is, dad still is, if you want to talk about resurrection. But I had great folks. But I had lots of other people in the generations above me who also provided parental something or other, right? And most of them, some of them were in the family, a lot of them were in our church, because our little church, was like family. This would be pretty much the whole church gathered together in the kind of church that I grew up in. A few more people than are here today. So, yeah, that's good to point out.
Rob, that I think as you don't really respect or appreciate your parents until you become one, and then you all of a sudden realize what your parents did for you
Sure.
over the years, and
Sure.
really changes that whole relationship when you become a parent.
Yes, it's amazing how much you learn about what life actually is as you experience that life, right? I like to think of this commandment in some sense directed at children, and even more so directed at teenagers. And I don't want to diss teenagers. I was a teenager once. You were a teenager once, right? And clearly, when Doreen, when your mother stopped liking you, that's when you were right. Okay. Little children have to learn that mom and dad are the boss. If a child is running the show, we're in serious trouble. That's all there is to it. Okay. At some point, the child gets to be old enough when they become a teenager that they think they know how to run the show, of course, and try to. But then, if they survive that experience and become parents themselves, then they learn how tough it was. But that's why the commandment is so important. You cannot let children run the show. You cannot let teenagers run the show. It takes some wisdom. It takes some maturity. All of that stuff. And so from the get-go, we have to understand that hierarchy of relationship. Now, we cannot take that. This commandment can be taken and has been taken historically to mean that children and teenagers should be ordered around, that they should not be respected in their own right, that they could be abused, perhaps. You can take this to an extreme. The commandment says you're supposed to honor me, therefore I get to be your master, your taskmaster, your owner, all that kind. Obviously can go all kinds of horrible places that this commandment taken by itself might lead you to think about. But if you take all the other commandments and everything else that God says about how we're meant to treat people, you cannot go there. You cannot go there, right? Yeah. What is honoring? Respecting? Say it again. Obey, yes. Admiring, esteeming, yes. How? Taking care of, yes. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. How do you show respect or honor?
You can validate them.
You validate, yes. Allow them to be who they are. Listening. Yeah, listening, paying attention. Yeah, yeah. I love to think about specific things that we actually do. It's one thing to say, I honor my parents. Okay, what'd you do? Well, I don't know. I just honor them. No, what did you do? Right? What did you do?
Well,
Yes, Nina.
Well, I think there's honoring and there's honoring. There's the kind of honoring that's outside of yourself where you make their dinner or, serve them in some way. But I find in my own life that honoring my parents, I find myself doing things that they have modeled for me. If I set a beautiful table, it takes me right to my mother's taste in things and doing things, and I find myself arranging things or doing some activity that would have been agreeable to them and probably was, and that's where I learn it. It's sort of just kind of continuing in my life a lot of the unspoken yet very apparent gifts that they gave me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I love that. You honor, it doesn't go back their direction, but it goes from them through you outwards. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. Yeah, I love that. Over here to Ruth. There we go.
When my son was a teenager, he liked to play soccer after school, and the school was a long walk from our house. And I worried about him because he didn't have anybody that he was walking with. And so I was there, and when he finally came home, I said, "Where have you been?" And he said, "Don't you know that God isn't through with me yet?"
Oh, yeah. Yes, yeah, that's good. Yes. It's good to be a theologian sometimes. Absolutely. Yes, we got more going here.
I was wondering, Jack, if you could comment on, I learned from you to think a lot of when we read scripture of the original audience. So I was thinking of all that the weary travelers had to face and what they've gone through. And it occurred to me that there were a lot of little kids amongst all those people at the time of this huge migration and being saved and resaved. So it's interesting to me how the second part is so that you may live long. How interesting at the time, maybe there was a significance, and you can comment on this, of how much in the audience, if they were kids, which were kind of back in that society pretty diminished along with women. But if you could comment about the original audience and how much of that might have even been at the time a significant point of God's commandments, knowing these little kids' ears were hearing this. Honor your father. You've been through a lot, little kids and all age kids. Honor your father and mother so that this land I'm bringing you to, you can live long, because they're teaching you my ways. So by honoring them, you're following those ways, and that it will create the future I intend for you as you grow old. I know that's a lot, but...
Yeah, no, that is a lot. And you're on to several things there. You're on to several things. I always go back to the original context. Why did these people need to hear that specific thing? I think there's lots of things going on. Think about this fact that after a year or two, there are going to be babies who are being born into this Jewish community, this Hebrew community, that have never lived back in Egypt. And they're going to say, "Mom and Dad, why are we wandering around out here, right? What's that about?" There are now, I don't know why I just thought of this, there are lots of children who are now 8 or 9 or even 10 years old, or 11 by now, from Syria, whose families left Syria, went into Jordan or Lebanon or Turkey. They're Syrian children who have never lived in Syria. They've been born as refugees. It's kind of that same dynamic. So part of the honoring is about listening to, paying attention to your parents and the experience that they had coming out of Egypt, so that you know who you are. Now that becomes more important with every successive generation. We're told essentially that the generation of people who left Egypt all die in the wilderness, and a new generation is born. Well, that new generation needs to know why they're here and where they're going. So part of honoring is learning from your history who you are. That's part of the commandment. But expand that now. It's not just for them, it's for us, right? You got here somehow or other. Not just you got here onto the planet, you were born, but you got here somehow or other because of what mom and dad did or did not do. And by extension, not just mom and dad, but who else after that? You have a grandfather, a couple of them, right? And grandmothers, right? And then keep going back. So this is, in some sense, about honoring all the past, paying attention to it, listening to it, respecting it. Even if it was horrible, even if your past is full of horse thieves and axe murderers, right? We don't honor that part, but we learn from that, right? We pay attention to that. So that's part of what's going on. Another part of the context here is that generally speaking, the societies of the ancient Near East were all highly patriarchal, okay, highly patriarchal. And the father was the absolute ruler of everything. Males were the absolute rulers of everything. But notice that this commandment says, honor your father and mother. That's radical. We don't hear that as radical because we've gotten used to the idea that women are superior to men, right? or whatever that might be, right? That doesn't seem strange to us at all, which is actually, that means we've made some progress. It means we've actually made some progress. But back then, to say, honor your father and mother was radical. Very, very radical. So here's one of the places from very early on in the story where you have a new thing being discussed, being promoted. This is what God says to do, okay? Here's another part of the context of this, that in ancient societies, you did not always pay close attention to the needs, especially of the elderly generation, right? Here's a simple fact of life, that when we are born, we are useless. In fact, we are 100% self-centered, needy creatures, especially as human beings, right? It takes a long time before a human being is able to take care of itself. So society invests a whole lot into brand new human beings. But then over time, a person becomes not a taker from, but a giver to society. And that goes for a period of time. And then as you get towards the end, once again, you become a taker from rather than a giver to. And this is thinking in very, very basic terms, right? You can't go out and tend the fields anymore, or look after the sheep, or do all of the things necessary for life. And so a baby is a liability, right? But at least the baby has the potential for being an asset. An old person is a liability, and all they are going to be is more and more and more of a liability. When you look at life from a strictly utilitarian point of view without any aspect of God involved in that. But when you bring God into the equation, then you bring in the idea that all of life is sacred, that all of life is beautiful, that we are meant to look for and respect the image of God that is built into each one of us, that has nothing to do with age or utility, usefulness. It has to do with the image of God that's built in. And so in ancient societies, oftentimes, sometimes old people were revered, sometimes old people were just put to the side, right? And that's not just an ancient issue. I can tell you plenty of stories where, it was just inconvenient to have mom or dad around anymore, so put them in a nursing home somewhere. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if you get put away so that you're just not a problem anymore, we have a problem, Houston, right? And so the commandment calls us to honor from the very beginning all the way to the very end. And we have begun to learn that in the honoring, there's an awful lot that even the oldest among us still have to give to society, right? That's not why we honor them. But in that honoring, we begin to learn there is still much to learn. So to come to the point of, so that it will go well, so that you will live long in the land that I'm giving you. This is the only commandment that has a promise attached to it, okay? Let me ask this question. Why? Why or how, maybe is a better way to ask it, how does honoring parents, honoring those generations that have come before us, how does that lead to our own longevity and success?